That night in Providence, my stepfather's hand struck me across the face before he dragged me to the door and screamed, I would never see a cent of my mother's $10 million will. The neighbors whispering as I collapsed in the street, humiliated and broken. But when the lawyer opened the folder days later and read my mother's signature aloud, everything Robert thought he owned began to crumble, and I am your narrator here to tell you exactly how the fight for truth and revenge unfolded. The night air in Providence was heavy and still pressing against the old siding of the house, as if it knew what was about to happen inside. I was 28 already, working endless hours as a paralegal downtown, but the moment I stepped back into that house, I felt 17 again, cornered and small under Robert's glare. He was my stepfather, a man who wore expensive suits and shook hands at Chamber of Commerce dinners, but behind closed doors, his face could twist into something cruel and mean. That night I had come home after staying late at the office, hoping to check on some of my mother's things in the study before Robert got rid of them. My mother Linda had passed only weeks earlier, and every memory of her felt like something fragile I needed to guard. Robert was waiting for me in the living room, his jaw tight, the smell of whiskey thick in the air. You think you can come in here and act like this is your house? He snarled, moving closer. His voice was loud enough that the walls seemed to vibrate. I tried to steady myself, clutching my purse strap so tightly the leather dug into my palm. I told him calmly that I was only there to collect a few of Mom's photo albums, that I wasn't planning to stay. He laughed, a sharp sound that made my skin crawl. Nothing in this house belongs to you. Nothing. He took a step forward, his face flushed, and then his voice rose, shaking the windows. You will never get a penny from your mother's $10 million estate. Not one damn cent! The words cut deeper than his fist ever could, but the blow came anyway. His arm swung wide, the back of his hand catching my cheek, and before I could react, he shoved me hard in the chest. My body hit the edge of the coffee table and then the carpet. The breath rushed out of me, and my vision blurred, pain spreading through my ribs. I heard the shuffle of shoes and whispers. The front door was half open, and through it I saw neighbors lingering at the edge of the porch light. One of my cousins, invited over for dinner that night, stood frozen near the staircase. No one moved. No one said a word. Some turned their heads away, as if pretending not to see would make it disappear. Get out! Robert bellowed. Get out and stay out! His shadow loomed over me, larger than life, and for a moment I thought he might kick me while I was still on the floor. I scrambled to my feet, dizzy and humiliated, every part of me burning. My mother's framed photo on the mantel seemed to watch, silent and powerless, as if she too was being forced to witness. I stumbled toward the door, past the faces that refused to meet my eyes. My cheek throbbed. My pride felt shattered, and yet something inside me hardened. His words echoed over and over, the promise that I would get nothing, that all my mother's love and effort meant nothing in his hands. On the porch, the night was cooler, the air damp with salt from the nearby bay. I clutched the railing, fighting to steady my breath. Behind me, his voice carried again, harsh and final. Don't you dare come back. This house, this money, all of it belongs to me. The neighbors whispered, their silhouettes shifting in the dark, some pitying, others judgmental. I felt every glance like a needle against my skin. My legs trembled, but I forced them to carry me down the steps, away from the porch light, into the street where the shadows were kinder. Each step was heavy, but I knew there was no turning back. That night did not just bruise my body, it carved a line between the life I had known and the fight that was waiting ahead. I did not yet know how I would challenge him, how I would uncover what my mother had left hidden, but I felt the spark of something fierce in my chest, burning quietly under the ache. I pressed a hand against the side of my face where his ring had cut the skin, and I walked faster, the sound of my own heartbeat drowning out his voice. For the first time I understood that survival meant leaving behind the silence that had kept me small. By the time I reached the corner of the street, the house was behind me, the porch light shrinking to a faint glow. I stopped there, breathing hard, and let the tears come. Not of weakness, but of release, of mourning for what had just been taken, and for what I would have to fight to reclaim. And in that pause, standing alone under the street lamp, I promised myself that Robert's words would not be the end of my story. It was only the beginning. The hum of the street lamp above me faded as I walked further into the night, but my mind was already drifting back to the first time Robert entered our lives. It was 2012, a year that still feels sharp and unfinished in my memory. I was 17 then, a high school senior in Providence, and my mother Linda had been alone for years since my father passed. She was a teacher at the local middle school, patient and soft-spoken with a laugh that always came from her whole body. When she told me she was marrying Robert Hayes, I wanted to be happy for her. She deserved love. She deserved someone to stand beside her after all the years of raising me on her own. Robert seemed polished at first, charming in a way that made people lean in when he spoke. He had a real estate firm in Boston and wore tailored suits even on Sunday mornings. At church, he shook hands with everyone, calling them by name, as if he had always been part of the community. For a little while, I believed the smile he gave my mother was real. But behind closed doors, the smile hardened. He began with little things, comments about how Mom spent too much on groceries, or how I should find a job, instead of focusing on my college applications. He controlled the thermostat, the dinner menu, even which friends were welcome in the house. Mom brushed it off, saying he just liked things neat, but I could see the way her shoulders tensed when he entered a room. One evening I came home from study group to find Robert sitting in the living room with my report card in his hand. He waved it in the air, his mouth curling into something like a grin. "You think good grades make you somebody, Sarah? In this house there is only one father." His voice filled the room, and Mom stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her face pale. I felt my throat tighten, but something inside me lit up a kind of stubborn fire. That was the night I decided I would study law, that I would never let him or any man like him decide who I was allowed to be. The years that followed were heavy with small humiliations. At family gatherings, he would joke about me being too ambitious, asking who would ever want to marry a girl who argued like a lawyer. He made comments about my clothes, about how I walked, about the hours I spent at the library. To the world, he was the generous stepfather who donated to the community center. But at home, he was a man who wanted everything under his name. Mom tried to keep peace, slipping me $20 bills when she could, encouraging me to keep pushing toward my dreams. She said she was proud of me, that one day my work would matter. I held on to those words like a lifeline. Even when Robert raised his voice, even when he slammed doors and made me feel like a guest in my own home, I remembered that my mother still saw me. I left for college in Boston, and the distance gave me air to breathe. But every holiday pulled me back into that house, into his orbit. I noticed how Mom's jewelry began to disappear piece by piece, how she no longer had access to her own checking account. He handled everything smiling as he told people that managing finances was a man's role. I hated him more, each year, hated the way he erased her voice until it was almost gone. And then last month, when Mom died, he stood at the funeral, shaking hands again, collecting condolences like they were business cards. People praised him for his strength, for taking care of everything. I stood there in black, my hands clenched, wondering how no one could see through him. Back in my apartment tonight, after leaving his house battered and humiliated, I dropped my bag on the table and sat down hard. My ribs ached where he had shoved me, but I forced myself to focus. I reached into the drawer where I kept a few of Mom's old letters, the ones she had given me when I turned 21. Beneath them was a worn envelope, cream-colored, with her handwriting on the front. I had found it tucked inside one of her cookbooks years ago, but never opened it, almost afraid of what it might contain. My hands trembled as I slid the letter out. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small key. The letter was short, just a few lines in her familiar script, telling me that if anything ever happened to her, I should take this envelope to a man named David Turner, an estate attorney in Boston. She wrote that he could explain what she wanted for me, that she had made arrangements to protect me. The key glinted in the lamplight, small and cold in my palm. My chest tightened, a mixture of grief and hope. For the first time since her death, I felt that maybe she had left me more than just memories. I folded the letter back into the envelope and pressed it to my chest. Tomorrow I would call David Turner. Tomorrow I would finally know what Mom had hidden all these years. For now, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, the city sounds drifting in through the window, and let myself breathe. The battle with Robert was far from over, but I had just uncovered the first weapon my mother had placed in my hands. When morning light slipped through the blinds, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the envelope like it might dissolve if I looked away. My coffee had gone cold hours ago untouched. The words in my mother's handwriting circled my mind again and again, telling me she had a plan, telling me I wasn't alone. I thought back to those years when I first left Providence for Boston carrying little more than a duffel bag and stubborn pride. I remembered the basement apartment I rented near campus, the smell of mildew mixing with the heat from the old radiator. While other students unpacked boxes from their parents' SUVs, I took the bus with 2 suitcases. My brother Mark had already graduated by then, his life neatly paved by Robert's money. He got an engineering job right out of school, a new car, and a condo partly financed by what Robert called a generous family loan. I, on the other hand, juggled 3 part-time jobs folding clothes at a department store, serving coffee at a cafe near campus, and filing papers at a small law office. Every dollar went to rent and textbooks. There were nights when exhaustion pressed so heavily I could barely lift my head off the library desk. Still, I studied tracing legal cases with a yellow highlighter, whispering promises to myself that I would never be powerless again. The unfairness stung every time I called home and heard Robert's voice boasting about Mark's promotion or his new trip to Europe. Mom's voice was softer in the background, careful and quick, slipping in words of encouragement when she could. One December evening during finals, an envelope arrived in the mailroom with my name written in her familiar script. Inside was a small card and a folded piece of paper. The card simply said, she was proud of me, proud of how I carried myself despite everything. The folded note carried heavier words. It said she had made arrangements that she could not explain everything yet, but that I should trust her. She ended it with one line that clung to me through every long night at the library: I have a plan to protect you. That secret promise became my fuel. When I walked to class in the freezing rain, when I served coffee to impatient customers at 6 in the morning, when I patched up my shoes because I could not afford new ones, I repeated those words. She had a plan. Back in the present, I ran my thumb along the old envelope and felt the edge of the key inside. My hands trembled, but steadied as I tucked it into my bag. Today was the day. The office of David Turner was only a few blocks from the courthouse, a tall glass building that mirrored the morning sky. As I walked toward it, my breath caught a mix of fear and anticipation. The city buzzed with life horns, blaring, people rushing with coffee cups. But inside me, everything slowed. Every step toward that building felt like another step away from Robert's shadow. I imagined him pacing in the big house, convinced he had stripped me of everything. He was unaware of this letter. He didn't know my mother had left something for me beyond his reach. The glass doors whooshed open as I entered the lobby, the cool air and polished marble a stark contrast to the weight I carried. I paused there, clutching my bag, feeling my mother's presence, as if she were walking beside me. I thought of the first time Robert declared himself the only father in the house, the way it burned into me like a brand. That night, I swore I would learn the law, and now here I was walking into a law office with her secret in my hands. The receptionist looked up with a polite smile. I gave my name, my voice steadier than I felt, and she motioned me toward a set of double doors. My reflection stared back from the polished brass handle. For a heartbeat I hesitated, remembering the years of being told I was nothing, of being shoved aside, of watching Mark live a life I had to claw for. Then I gripped the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the office smelled faintly of leather and ink, the walls lined with shelves of heavy books. A man in his 60s stood to greet me, his expression both professional and kind. He introduced himself as David Turner, the attorney my mother had trusted. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp with recognition when I slid the envelope across his desk. I did not know what he would find inside or how deeply Robert's lies had tangled around my mother's estate, but I knew this was the moment she had prepared me for. As David carefully unfolded the letter, I sat back in the chair, clutching my hands together, and drew one long breath. Whatever truth was about to be revealed, I was ready to hear it. David slid the letter from its envelope and read in a low, steady voice while I watched his eyes move line by line. But the room around me softened, and the last months rushed back like a tide I could not stop. My mother's diagnosis had arrived in early spring, a word that turned the kitchen into a waiting room and the house into a hallway of closed doors. She moved through treatment with that same quiet resolve she had used to guide seventh graders through algebra. I tried to match her calm, tried to bring soups and playlists and soft blankets, and each time Robert inserted himself with schedules and rules, as if grief needed a manager. He kept visitors short, sent neighbors away, with polite smiles that ended at the corners of his mouth, and told me he would handle all decisions. When hospice came, the house smelled of antiseptic and the citrus cleaner he favored. My mother rested with her window cracked to the garden, her eyes following the sway of the maple tree. She would squeeze my hand and tell me to rest, then ask me about the classes I loved most, the professors who challenged me. She did not talk about money. She did not talk about Robert. She saved her breath for what was beautiful, and I stored her voice inside me like a keepsake. She died on a Tuesday before dawn. The sky over Providence was the color of cold steel, and the birds had not begun to sing yet. Robert called family and the funeral home and the church within an hour. By noon there was a folder, an itinerary, a list of speakers in the order he approved. He told me he would take care of the eulogy, that he would speak on behalf of our family, that my role would be to greet guests and keep things moving. I heard the words as if from underwater. I asked to say a few sentences about the way she read to me when storms rattled the house, about how she hummed when she cooked. He shook his head and said the service needed to be concise and dignified. Anthony's was full the day of the funeral. The pews held former students, now grown neighbors with eyes rimmed in red, teachers from her school, clutching programs with her photograph. Robert stood at the pulpit with confident posture and delivered a speech about community service and resilience, about Linda as a teacher who believed in potential. He did not mention the maple tree or the blankets or the secret notes tucked into my lunch when I was small. He did not look at me while he spoke. When the music rose for the final hymn, he placed a hand at the small of my back and guided me to the reception hall with the efficient movements of a man hosting a gala. At the luncheon, he commanded the flow like he was closing a deal. He told the principal where to sit, told the deacons when to open the coffee urns, told the caterer to pack leftovers for later. Aunts and uncles came one by one to hug me and say I did not have to worry, that Robert would make sure everything was handled. I nodded until my jaw ached. In a corner near the bulletin board, my brother Mark stood with two cousins, his expression tight, his tie slightly askew. He asked if I needed anything, and when I said I wanted to say something at the service, he looked away and mumbled that the program had been set. By the time the crowd thinned, a few strangers lingered who did not look like parishioners. One of them was a young woman with a press badge clipped to her bag. She introduced herself as Sophia Green from the Providence Journal and said quietly that she had heard rumors my mother had sold some properties quickly in the months before she died, and that there were questions about where the proceeds had gone. Her voice was careful, more like a nurse than a reporter. She asked if I knew anything about it. I felt heat rise to my face. I said I did not know, and that it was not the time. She apologized and slipped me a card, saying she would be available if I needed to talk. Later that week, I stopped by the house to pick up a box of my mother's books, the ones she had promised to pass to me when I had my own place. Robert met me at the door with a firm expression and an air of ownership that made the foyer feel foreign. He had placed locks on the study and said he was organizing documents for the estate. He told me the house would be appraised and that there was a lot to do. He spoke in the passive voice, as if things simply happened without a person behind them. I recognized the cadence of control. When I asked if I could have the cookbook with the browned pages and her notes in the margins, he said it had sentimental value to him and he would think about it. Whispers grew in the weeks after. An old neighbor mentioned a sale that seemed rushed, a small beach cottage in Narragansett that had been in my family since before I was born. A retired teacher asked if the scholarship fund my mother used to talk about was still going to happen. I called Mark and asked if he knew anything about her accounts. He said Robert handled those things and that I should try to get along. A silence opened between us like a new hallway. It was at the memorial mass 1 month later, a smaller gathering for close friends, that Sophia approached me again outside the church. The wind was colder, and a few brown leaves chased each other across the parking lot. She said she had confirmed that 2 properties had been sold in the last quarter, and that the proceeds had been moved quickly. She spoke without accusation, only curiosity and concern, and asked if my mother had ever talked to an estate attorney. Her eyes watched my face closely, waiting for any sign that I might trust her. I thought of the small envelope hidden in my apartment. I thought of the key that had pressed into my palm, and the name David Turner written in my mother's hand. I felt a surge of protectiveness both for her memory and for whatever she had set in place. I told Sophia that my mother was a private person, and that if I had anything to share, I would reach out. Sophia nodded and said she understood, then told me that families often learned more than they expected once the legal process began. She pressed her card into my hand again and told me to take care of myself. Inside the church hall, Robert was laughing with a city councilman, his voice carrying easily over the room, his hand on the other man's shoulder. He looked the part of a grieving husband who had mastered his sorrow and moved on to logistics. The sight of it stung like lemon in a cut. I walked past the dessert table where someone had arranged my mother's favorite cookies and took one more for the motion than the taste. Aunt Rose touched my elbow and asked in a low voice if I was sleeping and eating. I said I was trying. She squeezed my arm and said she remembered the way my mother's eyes would soften when I entered a room. The kindness almost undid me. By the end of the day, I was back in my apartment, with the envelope laid out again on the table, the key catching the last light. I sat there listening to the faint rumble of a bus on the next street and let the overlapping scenes settle in my chest. Robert's control at the funeral, Mark's silence, Sophia's questions, the neighbor's rumor about the cottage, the locked study. It all formed a picture I did not want to name out loud yet. Now in David Turner's office, the picture shifted with every sentence he read. He paused, looked up at me and said my mother had met with him more than once. He said she had asked many questions about how to protect a daughter who might be intimidated or cut off after her death. He said she was clear and thoughtful and very firm about what she wanted. I felt my pulse beat in my throat. The room seemed to come back into focus. There was the desk, the bookshelf, the framed degrees, and the careful shape of his hands as he turned to the next page. I saw the place where his thumb rested and understood that whatever came next would be the first concrete proof that my mother had not left me defenseless. I thought again of Sophia in the parking lot, of her eyes searching mine when she asked about a secret trust. I had given her nothing that day. I had no answers. Now I was about to learn whether there was a truth big enough to pull me out of the shadow of Robert's control. David lifted his gaze and held it steady. I straightened in the chair and folded my palms together to keep them from shaking, and I waited for his next words. The dining room glowed with the soft light of candles set in the center of the long oak table, but nothing about the atmosphere felt warm. Plates clinked, faintly silverware scraped, and every word spoken carried the sharp edge of tension. Robert sat at the head like a king, surveying his kingdom. Mark on his right, their shoulders squared together as if preparing for battle. I sat further down, trying to keep my breathing steady, though every look in my direction felt like a silent accusation. Halfway through the meal, Robert set down his fork with a deliberate clang. The room hushed. His voice was calm at first, but each syllable dripped with disdain, as he reminded everyone that the estate was in his hands, that my mother had trusted him to make the right decisions, that I had no claim. He turned toward me, his lip curling, and said I was nothing but a drain, of failure who had brought shame to the family name. My cheeks burned not from guilt, but from fury pressing under my skin. Mark leaned forward, adding fuel. He spoke of responsibility and loyalty, saying Robert had been more of a father to him than anyone else, and that it was only natural the assets went to them. A few cousins nodded, their eyes downcast, not brave enough to meet mine. Others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their chairs, as though wishing they were anywhere else. Then a voice cut through, steady and unmistakable. Aunt Rose lifted her chin, her silver hair catching the candlelight. She said Linda would never abandon her daughter, that anyone who truly knew her knew how much she loved me, and that Robert's story did not add up. The table fell into silence, broken only by the hum of the heating vents. Robert's eyes darkened. He tried to wave her off, claiming she was clinging to sentiment. But Rose leaned forward, her voice rising just enough to tremble the glasses. She reminded everyone of the years my mother had worked, saved, and sacrificed for me, how she had paid for my first semester, before Robert insisted on taking control of all finances. She said she had seen the fear in Linda's eyes during the final months, fear that her wishes would be erased. The room shifted then like a tide turning. Some relatives murmured agreement. An uncle on my father's side cleared his throat and said maybe things should be looked at more carefully, that maybe Robert was too quick to dismiss me. Robert slammed his hand on the table, the plates rattling. He barked that the matter was closed, that lawyers would confirm it soon, and that anyone siding with me was delusional. My heart pounded, but I held my seat, my nails pressing into my palms. The argument swelled around me. Voices clashing, chairs scraping as people half rose and gestured angrily. My cousin Helen snapped back at Robert, accusing him of rewriting history. Mark shouted over her, his face red, defending Robert like a loyal soldier. Through the chaos, Aunt Rose locked eyes with me. Everything else seemed to blur. Her gaze was fierce, unwavering, like steel forged in fire. She told me that if I stayed silent, Linda's memory would be trampled. She said I had to stand up, that the truth could not speak for itself unless I gave it voice. Her words pierced deeper than Robert's insults ever could. The table erupted again, half the family now arguing openly, the other half retreating into silence. But I sat frozen, Rose's words echoing in me, steadying my pulse. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something stronger than grief. It was resolve, faint, but growing like an ember catching. As the shouting carried on, I quietly pushed my plate aside and folded my hands in my lap. I did not raise my voice, not yet. But inside, I knew Aunt Rose was right. If I did not rise, my mother would be forgotten, and Robert would win. The meal ended with people storming out, chairs scraping, accusations flung across the room like daggers. The house fell into a strained quiet after the last door shut. I remained seated, my breath steady, my gaze on the candle flickering in front of me. Rose's voice still lingered in my ears. "You must stand up or Linda will be forgotten." I reached for my glass of water and held it without drinking, staring into the rippling surface. The battle lines had been drawn, and for the first time, I was no longer alone. Morning came with a clean winter light and a clarity I had not felt in weeks. After the dinner that split our family into two uneasy camps, I called the attorney and asked to meet as soon as he could see me. He told me to come in that afternoon. I spent the hours before the appointment sorting the notes I had kept since the funeral. Small scraps of observation I had written in the margins of a notebook. Locked study, missing jewelry, sudden sale of the cottage. Neighbors turned away at the door. Each line felt like a stitch in a larger pattern I could finally name without flinching. The lobby of the building on State Street smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish. My reflection drifted over the glass as I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button with a steady finger. When the doors opened, I was met by the same dark wood and soft lighting. I remembered the same sense that words held weight here. The receptionist nodded and ushered me back. I walked past framed certificates and photographs of city skylines until I reached the office with the corner window. David stood as I entered and offered a seat. He had the letter open on his desk along with a neat folder and a small stack of copies. The business card beside his hand read, "David T. Johnson," in a simple serif font. He spoke evenly, telling me he had reviewed my mother's file and that there were important documents I needed to see. He said she had been precise and careful, and that she had returned to update her plan more than once. He said she had wanted to protect me. He turned the folder toward me and drew out a document on thick paper with an embossed seal. He explained that it was a certificate of trust, a summary prepared to avoid exposing account numbers and other confidential details. He said the trust had been created 3 years earlier under Rhode Island law and funded with substantial assets. He said the figure was $10 million at the time of funding, comprised of liquid accounts and proceeds from certain property sales. He pointed to a paragraph that identified the initial trustee and the successor trustee. My breath stalled when I saw my name. He did not linger on legal language. He told me in straightforward terms that a living trust is designed to hold property while the person is alive and to pass it smoothly at death, often outside of probate. He said my mother had placed assets into this trust and had named me as the person to manage and benefit from it after her death. He said there was a will on file with the Providence Probate Court that poured any remaining assets into the trust, and that a docket sheet had been created when the will was lodged. He slid a photocopy of that docket sheet across the desk so I could read the case number and filing date, and my chest tightened with relief that something official existed beyond the reach of rumor. Then he drew my attention to a short section printed in clean, spare lines. He said it was a no-contest clause. He described it plainly. If any beneficiary or interested party contested the plan in bad faith, that person would forfeit any benefit they might otherwise have received. He said this kind of clause is not a magic shield, but it is a strong deterrent. He added that the trust language was clear about my stepfather's role, which was to say that he did not have one. I felt warmth rise behind my eyes. He flipped to the last page and tapped the signature line. The loops and angles were all hers. Linda Miller written in familiar strokes above the notary's seal. A second page carried a later date with an amendment and another signature, the ink just a shade different, as if the pen had run dry and she had pressed harder. For a moment the room went quiet inside me. The hum of the heater faded. The city noise dissolved. All I could see was her name steady and deliberate, an anchor laid into paper. I traced the air above the letters without touching the page. My mother had sat in this very place, or one much like it, and made choices that told the truth about who she was. She had done this while she was sick, while someone in our house was watching the clock and measuring visitors, while the weight of the future leaned against her ribs. She had signed her name anyway. I asked what would happen next. David said we would prepare formal notices to all interested parties, as required, including my stepfather, my brother, and any other individuals named in the will. He said the trust allowed for immediate administration by the successor trustee, which was me, and that we would gather account statements and deeds and confirm titling. He said in calm, practical words that he would handle communication with opposing counsel if Robert hired a lawyer, and that we would keep a meticulous record of everything. He reminded me to keep copies of any messages I received from family members regarding the estate. He paused and studied my face. He asked how I was sleeping. The question startled me and steadied me at the same time. I told him the nights came in waves and that sometimes I woke with the sensation that the house was closing in again. He nodded and said grief has its own calendar, but that structure helps. He suggested that naming the tasks could make the days feel navigable. He slid a simple to-do list across the desk with boxes to check. Notice letters, inventory request, safe deposit visit, meeting with banker. He then produced a slim binder with tabs and placed it near my hand. He said it contained a copy of the certificate, a copy of the will, as filed the docket sheet, and a 3-page summary of next steps written in plain language. He said I could keep this with me and bring it to all meetings, so I never had to rely on memory alone. He said I should store the original letter and key in a safe place. He asked if the key meant anything specific. I told him about my mother's old safe deposit box at a credit union near the river, and how she used to keep birth certificates and school photos there. He said he would arrange access as successor trustee, and that we would see what was inside. The conversation stayed grounded. He avoided jargon unless I asked. He did not rush me when I was silent. He answered questions I did not know how to phrase, anticipating the places fear might disguise itself as confusion. He explained that the will would still pass through probate for any assets not already in the trust, but that the trust itself controlled the major property and accounts. He explained that the no contest clause would not keep a determined person from creating noise, but that it would give the court a clear framework if someone attempted to undermine my mother's intent. He spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had done this many times, and with a gentleness that made it possible for me to listen without bracing for impact. I asked about timing. He said we would send notices this week and expect responses within a standard period. He said there might be a hearing date set for the will routine and mostly administrative. He said we would attend and present the documents, and that I would answer a few simple questions. He said it would be useful to bring a supportive family member. Aunt Rose's face rose in my mind, her eyes bright against the candlelight, and I nodded. At one point, he excused himself to retrieve a file from the records room. I sat alone with the binder open and the signature staring back at me. I touched the edge of the paper and felt the texture under my finger. For the first time since the night Robert threw me out, my hands were steady. The anger I had been carrying like a live wire settled into something cleaner. Not resignation, not even relief. It felt like traction, the sense that my feet were finally on a surface I could push against. David returned with a slim envelope. He said the bank would honor my authority under the trust, and that we had an appointment set for the next morning to open the safe deposit box. He recommended that I bring someone I trusted to be present. He said he would be there as well. He asked if I felt safe going home to my apartment after all of this. I said yes. Then I admitted that safe was a word that felt new in my mouth. He smiled in a way that did not erase the gravity of what we were doing. He stood, and I stood with him. He said he would walk me through each step, and that the plan would hold. He said my mother had been very clear. I slipped the binder into my bag and thanked him. When I stepped back into the corridor, the air felt cooler, as if the building itself breathed. The elevator doors closed on the soft impression of carpet and the quiet ticking of a distant clock. In the lobby, I paused beside a long window that looked out over the street. People moved with purpose below, small and fast and full of their own dramas. I pressed my palm against the leather strap of my bag and felt the square corner of the binder through the canvas. Outside, cold air met my face and brightened my thoughts. I took out my phone and typed a short message to Aunt Rose, asking if she could come with me in the morning. I did not describe the documents yet. I only told her that Mom had prepared more than we knew, and that I would explain soon. I tucked the phone away and started down the steps, the city noise rising to meet me. At the curb, I stopped and looked both ways, the way my mother had taught me when I was small. Then I crossed toward the bus stop, with the weight of the binder firm against my hip and my mother's name steady in my mind. I barely slept that night, the binder resting on the nightstand like a silent guard. By morning, I decided Robert was not going to scare me back into silence. I pulled on a navy suit I had bought secondhand during law school, brushed my hair into a tight knot, and headed for the courthouse. The clerk pointed me to courtroom 3B, where Judge Harris presided. He was in his late 50s with sharp eyes behind glasses and a calm voice that somehow carried authority. When my case was called, I stepped forward, hands trembling, but my words steady. I asked for a temporary restraining order, laying out the threats, the violence, the humiliation in front of neighbors. The judge studied me for a long moment before granting the order. He signed it right there, the sound of his pen across the paper like a gavel inside my chest. I left the courthouse with the document clutched to my chest. It said in clear print that Robert Hayes was prohibited from contacting me, coming near my apartment, or interfering with legal proceedings. For the first time in years, I felt the law on my side. But Robert did not take the news quietly. That afternoon, he showed up outside the office where David Johnson worked. I saw him through the glass doors, pacing like a caged animal, his jaw tight with fury. I froze, remembering the bruises, but David stepped between us and reminded him of the order. Robert sneered and shoved at the door, trying to push his way inside. The receptionist dialed 911, and within minutes, 2 uniformed officers appeared. Their radios crackled as they ordered him to step back. He roared that I was poisoning his family, that everything belonged to him that my mother had promised. When he refused to move, the officers twisted his arms behind him and snapped on the cuffs. The sound was sharp and final. Robert's face went pale as the officers recited his rights. Passers-by on the sidewalk slowed to watch. One man even took out his phone, filming as Robert was led to the squad car. I stood rooted to the floor, my pulse pounding, the paper in my hand trembling. An officer returned to the reception desk and handed David a copy of the incident report. The header read, Boston Police Department Incident Number 23 45891. I scanned the lines numbly, noting the charges of violating a restraining order and disorderly conduct. David looked at me with quiet firmness. "This is only the beginning," he said. "But today, you stood your ground." As the squad car pulled away, I caught a glimpse of Robert through the window, still shouting, still believing he had the final word. But with the cuffs biting into his wrists and the case number logged into the system, I felt something shift. For the first time since my mother's funeral, I breathed without fear. The man who had ruled our lives with threats was no longer untouchable. And as I stepped out into the fading afternoon light, I realized I had taken back a small piece of my power, and there was no going back. The following morning, my phone buzzed non-stop. Friends, colleagues, even neighbors were sending me the same link. Sophia Green's byline stretched across the top of the Boston Herald's website, the headline screaming about Robert Hayes, prominent real estate figure, arrested for violating a restraining order amid allegations of abuse and financial misconduct. My stomach twisted as I read through the paragraphs. Sophia had been careful, citing court records, interviews with former employees, and even whispers from people in our neighborhood. She painted a picture of a man who built his image as a family man, while quietly crushing anyone who dared to stand against him. And now his arrest was splashed in full color with a grainy photo of him in handcuffs, his face contorted in rage. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the screen, my coffee untouched, my chest tight with a mix of relief and dread. The story had gone viral. Local stations replayed footage of him being led into the squad car. Talk shows debated whether this would finally pull back the curtain on Boston's real estate elite. By midday, the Boston Business Council announced they were suspending Robert's membership pending investigation. His once cherished seat at the table of city leaders evaporated in a single press release. I watched live as two anchorwomen read the statement, their voices crisp and almost gleeful. My phone buzzed again with a message from Aunt Rose saying justice was catching up with him faster than anyone could have guessed. But the ripple effects went further. Within days, one of his largest partners pulled out of a development deal near Cambridge. Another investor terminated a contract citing reputational risk. Headlines spoke of a collapse in confidence around Hayes Realty. His empire, once propped up by charm and connections, began to crumble like wet plaster. Sophia was relentless. Her second article dove into public records, uncovering that Robert had leveraged Linda's assets to cover personal debts years earlier. Seeing my mother's name linked to loan documents made my throat close up. She had worked her entire life as a teacher, saved diligently, trusted him with her future, and he had siphoned off what she built to prop up his own reckless ventures. David Johnson called me into his office, his brow furrowed but his tone steady. "This could work in our favor," he said, sliding the newspaper across the desk. "The public perception is shifting, and that matters in court." I nodded, though my hands shook, as I folded the paper. I wanted to feel triumphant, but all I could think about was my mother signing documents under his gaze, probably believing she was securing stability for her family. The betrayal stung deeper than any headline could convey. At night, the television blared with panel discussions. A clip played of Robert outside his gated home, shoving past reporters, shouting that the allegations were lies, that his enemies were trying to ruin him. His face, once carefully managed for cameras, now looked twisted with fury, sweat glistening under the harsh lights. I stood in the living room watching him unravel in front of the community that once applauded him. His neighbors, who once invited him to charity dinners, now whispered behind curtains. A friend texted me that his own board members had voted to suspend his authority over upcoming projects. Each new blow left him angrier, more isolated, his mask stripped away piece by piece. And while the city turned its back on him, I sat in quiet stillness, grappling with the strange weight of seeing the man who had tormented me reduced before everyone's eyes. It was not victory, not yet. But the tide had turned, and Robert Hayes was no longer untouchable. The morning of the meeting, I walked into David Johnson's office with my palms damp and my throat dry. The air smelled faintly of leather and old books, and my stomach churned as I saw the long, polished table already lined with chairs. Robert was seated near the head, his suit pressed, his eyes sharp and cold, the faintest smirk curling his lips. Mark sat beside him, his shoulders tense, his gaze fixed on the floor. Aunt Rose gave me a small nod from across the room, her presence a lifeline. She leaned close and whispered that I belonged here, no matter what anyone said. I sat down, keeping my chin lifted, though my chest felt tight. David entered carrying a binder thicker than my arm. He greeted us with professional calm, his eyes flicking briefly toward me as if to steady my nerves. Robert cleared his throat loudly and announced that this meeting was unnecessary, that Linda's estate had been settled in spirit long ago. He said my mother would have wanted everything streamlined and in capable hands, meaning his. His words sliced through me, but I pressed my fingers into the armrest and stayed silent. David opened the binder, his voice smooth, as he began outlining the terms of Linda Miller's living trust. He explained that the trust was valued at $10 million, structured carefully to protect against mismanagement. Robert shifted in his seat, scoffing under his breath. David turned a page, then slid a document across the table toward me. He stated clearly that Linda had named me the primary beneficiary and trustee of the entire trust. My breath caught. I looked down at the familiar handwriting, my mother's signature inked in careful loops, her presence suddenly alive in that simple flourish of pen. Robert slammed his palm on the table. "This is a forgery," he barked. "No court would uphold it." His face was red, veins standing out on his temples. David remained composed, explaining that the trust had been notarized, filed, and carried a no-contest clause. Anyone who challenged it risked forfeiting their claim entirely. For the first time, silence spread across the table. Mark's head lifted, his eyes darting between the pages in Robert's fury. I caught a flicker of doubt in his expression, the certainty he had carried cracking at the edges. He swallowed hard, but said nothing. Aunt Rose's voice broke the silence, firm and unwavering. "Linda loved both her children," she said, "but she knew who had stood beside her when things were hardest. Sarah was the one who deserved her protection." Robert's fists clenched. His voice rose, accusing everyone of conspiring against him. The polished mask he wore in public slipped completely, leaving only raw anger and desperation. I touched the paper, gently tracing the ink as if it could steady me. The weight of my mother's decision settled into my bones. For years I had felt powerless, cast aside, beaten down. And in that moment, with the truth in black and white before all of us, the balance shifted. Mark leaned back, his jaw tight, his hands clasped so hard his knuckles turned white. He did not defend Robert. He did not defend me either. But the silence spoke louder than words. Robert's voice cracked as he demanded another chance to speak, but David's tone cut through him like steel. The trust was binding, he said, and its terms were final. The room felt heavier with every second, as if the walls themselves were bearing witness. I met Robert's glare and did not look away. His power was slipping, and he knew it. The meeting adjourned with the scrape of chairs, the echo of footsteps in the hallway. My hands trembled as I tucked the papers into my bag, the ink still burning in my vision. Outside the office windows, the city moved on, as if nothing had changed, but for me, everything had. The tide was no longer just turning. It was pulling me forward into a fight I was finally ready to face. David asked me to sit back down, before leaving his expression unreadable as he pulled another thin folder from his briefcase. My pulse picked up again. I thought the battle had been settled, but he explained that there was one more document Linda had left, something he had been instructed to reveal only after the trust itself had been acknowledged. He slid the folder across the table. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a supplemental trust, smaller than the first, but carrying its own weight. It outlined a portfolio of stocks valued at $2 million, set aside specifically in my name. My eyes caught the stipulation written clearly in Linda's handwriting that at least 25% of this fund must be used to create a scholarship for underprivileged law students. For a moment, I could not breathe. My throat tightened, as if I were standing face to face with my mother again. hearing her voice urging me not just to survive, but to lift others. Tears blurred the ink, and I brushed them away quickly. This was not about money alone. It was about meaning, about legacy. Robert's bitter laugh cut through the air. He mocked the idea of wasting funds on strangers, saying my mother had been naive to trust me with anything so impractical. His words bounced off me differently this time. They no longer carried the power to pierce me. Instead, they revealed his emptiness. Aunt Rose leaned closer, her voice soft but steady. "Your mother wanted you to carry her heart forward," she said. "That is why she trusted you with this." David nodded, confirming the legality. The supplemental trust did not change the $10 million estate, but stood beside it as an expression of intent and responsibility. He explained that as trustee, I had both freedom and duty, and that the clause was enforceable. Mark shifted in his seat, his expression clouded. He murmured that Mom always believed education could change lives. His voice cracked slightly, and I realized the truth was sinking into him, even if he had not chosen my side openly. I pressed my palm flat against the page, letting the weight of the words ground me. I thought of my own years scraping by in college, the nights I had studied under flickering lights, with an empty stomach, the bitterness of watching Mark live comfortably while I counted pennies. The thought that other young people might never feel that despair because of this fund filled me with a strange burning pride. I lifted my head and spoke clearly, my voice no longer shaking. I said I would establish the Linda Miller Foundation, that it would provide scholarships to students of law who could not afford tuition, that my mother's name would live on, not only through her money, but through the opportunities it created. For the first time since the nightmare began, the room fell into silence, not of hostility, but of recognition. Even David's professional mask softened, and Aunt Rose reached for my hand. Robert scowled, muttering curses under his breath, but his anger felt smaller against the weight of what had just been declared. I closed the folder gently and tucked it with the others, a sense of clarity settling inside me. My mother had not only fought for me, but had left me a torch to carry forward. This fight was bigger than my survival. It was about honoring her vision and proving that her love could ripple far beyond our fractured family. As I walked out of the office into the crisp evening air, the city lights flickered against the glass towers around me. I held the binder close, my mother's signature etched in my mind, and for the first time I felt not just like a daughter clinging to what was left, but like a woman stepping into her own place in the world. The headlines came first, splashed across the Boston Globe and local news sites. Robert Hayes under investigation for fraud, for breach of contracts, for debts he had hidden behind the polished veneer of his empire. One by one, the deals collapsed. Developers withdrew, banks demanded repayment, and the glossy brochures of his luxury projects were tossed into recycling bins. His phone stopped ringing. The same people who had once courted his presence now refused to shake his hand. I watched it unfold from a distance, not with glee, but with a strange stillness. Karma was not fast, but it was certain. The man who had called himself invincible was unraveling in front of the same city that once applauded him. Aunt Rose clipped every article and laid them out on her kitchen table. Her lips pursed as she muttered that Linda must be smiling somewhere. Weeks later, I saw him in person again, not in his tailored suit, but in a wrinkled jacket outside Suffolk County Courthouse. His hair had gone thin and gray at the edges, his posture slumped. He looked smaller, like a balloon slowly deflating. For a moment, I almost did not recognize the man who had once filled our house with booming orders and fists against the walls. Inside the courtroom, he tried to muster his old authority. He raised his voice, accused me of manipulating my mother, accused David of corruption, accused the system of conspiring against him. The judge let him finish, then reminded him that the documents were binding, the trust was lawful, and that his attempts to intimidate me had already cost him. The gavel came down like a quiet thunder, and Robert was silenced. He glanced at me as if daring me to speak, waiting for me to lash out or strike back. I did not. I only looked at him with a calm I had never known I could carry. I realized in that moment that revenge had already been served by forces larger than me. I had not needed to destroy him. He had done it to himself, brick by brick, lie by lie. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded him. questions about missing funds, unpaid workers' lawsuits piling in Massachusetts courts. He shoved past them, but the cameras followed. His face that once graced real estate magazines was now splashed across TV screens as the cautionary tale of greed and downfall. Mark stood quietly nearby, hands buried in his pockets. He said nothing as Robert stormed away. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw not triumph, but a weary acknowledgement that everything had shifted. The man he once looked up to was finished. Walking down the courthouse steps, I felt the weight slide from my shoulders. The fear that had chased me through my 20s, the humiliation that had pressed on my chest like a stone, the sting of being cast out with nothing but anger and bruises, all of it dissolved under the clear autumn sky. Robert Hayes no longer held power over me or over anyone. I paused on the sidewalk listening to the city's hum, the sound of traffic and voices layered like a song of ordinary life. My mother's name lived on in the trust in the foundation I was building, and in the quiet dignity I carried away from the courthouse. Robert's name lived in scandal columns and bitter whispers. That was the balance I had been waiting for, not an act of revenge carried out by my own hand, but the simple certainty that justice, slow and steady, had done what I could not. And as the courthouse doors swung shut behind me, I knew I no longer needed to look back. The weeks after the trial passed with a strange quiet, as if the noise of years had finally dimmed. I returned to the old Miller house, the one Robert once claimed would never belong to me, and stood in the front yard beneath the wide maple tree. The windows needed repair, the paint had faded, but to me it was still home. The air carried the memory of my mother's voice calling me in for dinner, and for the first time in over a decade, I did not feel like an intruder on my own doorstep. Mark came a few days later. I heard his car door shut, and when I opened the front door, he was already halfway up the steps, his hands awkwardly shoved in his pockets. He looked older than his 32 years, worn down by loyalty to the wrong man, and the sudden collapse of everything he thought stable. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he said he was sorry, not in the half-hearted way of someone forced to, but with the raw tone of a brother who finally understood what he had stood by and allowed. We sat in the living room surrounded by boxes that still smelled faintly of my mother's perfume. Mark admitted that he had known Robert manipulated money, that he had ignored the way I was treated, because he wanted to believe life was easier if he kept his head down. His voice cracked when he said he should have defended me, that Mom would have wanted us to hold together. I listened, and the anger I expected did not rise. Instead, there was a gentler ache, the kind that leaves room for forgiveness. I told him we both had scars from Robert, only mine were visible sooner. His eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since childhood, he hugged me tightly, like he was afraid to let go. Rebuilding the house became my new project. Contractors came and went, neighbors peeked in, and slowly the walls brightened again. But it was never just about restoring a home. It was about reshaping it into something larger than me. With David's guidance, I set aside part of the supplemental trust, $2 million in shares, and created the Linda Miller Foundation. The first goal was a scholarship for law students from low-income families, the ones who might otherwise give up before they could even try. At the launch event held in the restored dining room with its long oak table polished again, I stood in front of students and community leaders and spoke about my mother. I said she had been a teacher who believed in voices that were too often silenced, that her signature on those trust papers was not only for me, but for everyone who felt powerless. As I looked at the young faces in the room, I felt her hand on my shoulder, steady and proud. Mark helped too. He offered his engineering skills to refurbish the attic into a study space and to build ramps for accessibility. Aunt Rose baked pies for every volunteer day, laughing louder than she had in years. Even Sophia, the journalist who had uncovered Robert's lies, stopped by with notebooks and recorded the transformation, saying the city needed stories of resilience just as much as scandal. When the house finally reopened as a community center, I walked through the new front doors, while children's voices echoed in the halls. The sound was nothing like the silence of the night Robert had shoved me out, the night the door slammed shut behind me, and I thought I had lost everything. Now another door had opened wide, and welcoming, filled with life. That evening I sat alone in the office that once belonged to my mother. On the desk lay the binder David had given me, the one with her neat handwriting and the bold stroke of her name. I traced the curve of each letter, hearing her whisper from years ago, telling me she had a way to protect me. I leaned back in the chair, the windows open to the cool Boston air, and closed my eyes. The girl who had been humiliated in front of neighbors was gone. In her place stood a woman who had turned pain into purpose, who had carried her mother's legacy into something unbreakable. If you have ever been cast aside, belittled, or stripped of what you thought was yours, remember this. Justice does not always come in the way we imagine, but it can arrive in the most unexpected of forms.